They dismissed him, underestimated him, and treated him like a fool until he exposed a legal fraud right in front of the judge. The courtroom had already made up its mind before he even spoke. Jared Calloway stepped forward, his suit a little too worn, his tie slightly askew, but his posture steady. He wasn't a lawyer, and he never claimed to be. He was just a man who refused to let his grandmother's home be stolen by a corporate machine that saw people as nothing more than numbers on a balance sheet. Judge Walter Grayson peered over his glasses, the corners of his mouth twitching, somewhere between amusement and skepticism. He leaned back, tapping his gavel lightly. Once. "Mr. Calloway, representing yourself?" The question dripped with condescension. Jared met his gaze, unfazed. "Yes, Your Honor." A chuckle from the other side of the room. Bryce Sterling, corporate bulldog, ruthless, steamrolling small-time defendants, that was his specialty. Jared, he wasn't even a challenge. Sterling leaned toward his assistant, muttering under his breath. "This should be quick." The assistant smirked, knowingly. Jared heard it. He was meant to hear it. That was the point. But his expression didn't waver. He'd been counted out before, and they had no idea what was coming. He knew what it felt like to be dismissed, underestimated. And that's exactly why he was here. Judge Grayson sighed, flipping through the case file. "This is a property dispute, correct?" "A foreclosure challenge?" Jared nodded. "Yes, sir. My grandmother's home." Grayson barely glanced at him. "And you believe you can argue this case against a seasoned attorney like Mr. Sterling?" Jared didn't flinch. "I don't believe, Your Honor." Beat. "I know." The room went quiet, a few muffled chuckles from the corporate side. But beneath the laughter, something else, a shift, subtle, but real, the kind of silence that comes when someone unexpected refuses to back down. Judge Grayson shook his head, unimpressed. "Very well, let's get on with it." But Jared wasn't just here to argue. He was here to win. And they had no idea what was coming. The judge's skepticism? That was only the beginning. The real challenge sat across the aisle. The man who had already decided. Jared had lost. Bryce Sterling, a slow adjustment of his tie, a smug smile, barely concealed. This was his playground, the courtroom, the rules, the strategy. He had crushed dozens like Jared Calloway before, no degree, no firm backing him, no experience. This wasn't a case, it was a warm-up. Judge Grayson exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. "Mr. Sterling, you may proceed with your opening statement." Sterling rose, with the ease of a man who had done this 1,000 times, a slow buttoning of his jacket, a calculated step toward the jury. His voice? Smooth, confident. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is simple." A gesture toward Jared, without so much as a glance. "We have a man who refuses to accept reality. The property in question? Rightfully acquired by my client through legal foreclosure. The law is clear. The facts are irrefutable. This is not about emotions. This is about contracts, deadlines, obligations. My client followed the law." A pause, letting the words settle, as if the case had already been decided. Jared sat still, unshaken. He had expected this, but what Sterling didn't expect, what none of them did, was that Jared Calloway had come prepared. Mr. Calloway did not. A well-placed pause, a slow turn, a casual shrug. "I sympathize. Losing a home is painful. Beat. But pain does not override legal responsibility. The numbers don't lie." Sterling nodded once toward the judge, then sank into his seat, hands folded, as if the case was already over. Jared didn't move, didn't react. He had expected this, but as he rose from his chair, he caught something, the way Judge Grayson leaned back, arms crossed, the look of a man watching something he had already decided wasn't worth his time. Jared cleared his throat, voice steady. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Sterling is right about one thing. Beat. The law is clear. The question is, beat, slow, deliberate. Does his client actually follow it? A flicker of irritation crossed Sterling's face. Jared kept going. I've spent the last 6 months studying every case, every statute, every loophole that banks and corporations use to strip homes away from families. And I found something. Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow. Something? Jared nodded. Yes, and it changes everything. A quiet laugh from Sterling. Oh, this should be good. Jared ignored him. Instead, he turned to the judge. Before I begin, Your Honor, I'd like to submit an official request for discovery. Beat. Because I have reason to believe the plaintiff is hiding something. The energy in the room shifted. A rustle of movement. Judge Grayson sat forward, expression no longer amused. Hiding what, Mr. Calloway? Jared locked eyes with Sterling. Beat, slow, deliberate. Fraud. The word landed like a slow-burning fuse. No more chuckles, no smirks, just silence. Sterling's confident expression wavered. Judge Grayson, for the first time, gave Jared more than just a passing glance. Fraud? The judge's voice held skepticism, but something else too, curiosity. Jared nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I believe the foreclosure on my grandmother's home was based on forged documents. Beat, letting it sink in. And I can prove it, if I'm allowed full discovery. A sharp breath from Sterling. He shook his head. Your Honor, this is absurd. A baseless accusation meant to stall the inevitable. The property was seized under standard foreclosure proceedings. Jared tilted his head. Standard? Beat, then a step forward. Voice steady. Tell me, Mr. Sterling, how standard is it for a bank to foreclose on a house when the original mortgage documents contain 2 different signatures from the same person? A ripple of murmurs through the courtroom. Sterling's jaw tightened. What are you talking about? Jared didn't answer immediately. Instead, a slow, deliberate movement. He reached into his folder, pulled out 2 copies of the original mortgage agreement. Without hesitation, he walked to the bailiff, handing them over. Your Honor, these are 2 separate copies of the same document. One from the initial filing, the other from a later modification. Beat, let it land. If you look at the signatures, you'll notice something. Slight pause, building suspense. They don't match. Judge Grayson leaned in, scanning the pages. His forehead creased. Jared pressed on. Now, I'm no handwriting expert, but I know my grandmother's signature. Beat, soft but firm. And that second one, that's not hers. The judge flipped through the documents again. His expression shifted, no longer dismissive. Now, focused. His gaze snapped to Sterling. Mr. Sterling, do you have an explanation for this? Sterling cleared his throat. Your Honor, this is nothing more than an attempt to muddy the waters. Signatures can change over time. Jared didn't let up. Maybe, Beat, leaning in slightly. But that second signature, it's from a document filed only 3 months after the original. And if you compare them side by side, a gesture toward the papers in the judge's hands, not only do they look completely different, but the second one was signed. Pause, letting the weight of it build. The day after my grandmother was hospitalized for a stroke. A hush fell over the room. Even the jury leaned in. Judge Grayson turned back to Sterling. This time, his tone sharper. Mr. Sterling, does your client have the original signed documents on file? A flicker of hesitation, quick, barely noticeable. But Jared saw it, and so did the judge. Sterling cleared his throat. We would need time to retrieve them, Your Honor. Jared smiled. "That's fine. I'll wait." The silence in the courtroom had shifted. It wasn't just intrigue anymore. It was doubt. But Jared wasn't just here to raise questions. He was here to dismantle their case, piece by piece. And this was only the beginning. Judge Grayson exhaled sharply, flipping through the documents again. His eyes flicked between the mismatched signatures, fingers tapping against the bench. The same judge who had been so sure of Jared's incompetence now looked interested. But Sterling? He was already scrambling to regain control. "Your Honor, these documents don't change the core of the case. The defendant is grasping at straws, hoping to delay the inevitable. The bank followed the legal process. That's what matters." Jared let the words settle for a moment. Then he spoke. "Followed the legal process?" A slow exhale, a slight shake of his head. "Mr. Sterling, do you even know who your client bought this debt from?" Sterling blinked. "What does that have to do with anything?" Jared turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the mortgage was sold 3 times before it landed with the current lender." 3 separate times. A pause, reaching into his folder again. Another document. Another crack in their defense. He walked it to the bailiff. "And that's where it gets interesting." Judge Grayson took the papers, scanning them. Sterling's jaw tightened. Jared pressed on. Each time the loan changed hands, it should have been accompanied by an endorsement. An official transfer from one lender to the next. Beat letting it build. But if you look closely... Sterling shifted, visibly uncomfortable. Judge Grayson's brows knitted together. Beat, then the revelation lands. "There's no signature on the last transfer." Jared nodded. "Exactly. Which means the last company had no legal right to foreclose on my grandmother's home." A pause, a deliberate pause. "And the bank that did?" He let the moment hang. "They never actually owned the loan in the first place." A hushed murmur swept through the courtroom. The tension thickened. The weight of Jared's words settled over the room. Sterling sat forward, his voice tight. "Your Honor, this is—" Judge Grayson cut him off. "This is a problem." A slow, steady breath. Jared had them exactly where he wanted them. They had laughed at him, dismissed him. But now, no one was laughing anymore. Exposing the fraud was one thing. Proving intent? That was where Jared was about to hit them hardest. Sterling's composure was cracking. The smooth, confident attorney, the man who had treated this case like a mere formality, was now scrambling for control. Judge Grayson leaned forward, his tone sharp. "Mr. Sterling, I assume your client has an explanation for why this mortgage was transferred without proper endorsement." A hesitation, brief, but damning. "Your Honor, I would need to confer with my client before making a statement on that." Jared tilted his head. "You mean the same client who has been submitting legally questionable documents in multiple foreclosure cases, just like this one?" Sterling's head snapped toward him. "That's an outrageous claim." Jared didn't blink. "Is it?" He reached into his folder, pulled out another document. "Because I took the liberty of researching your client's foreclosure history." Beat, leaning in slightly. "Turns out my grandmother's house isn't the only one they acquired under these exact circumstances." Another document. Another blow. He handed it to the bailiff. The bailiff passed it to the judge. Judge Grayson scanned the pages. His expression? Darkening. Slowly, he exhaled, looking up at Sterling. "This case isn't looking as simple as you suggested, Mr. Sterling." Sterling's jaw tensed, but before he could speak, Jared stepped forward. "Your Honor, I'd like to call a witness." Grayson's gaze lifted. "A witness?" Jared nodded. "Yes. The person who notarized the second mortgage signature." Beat, letting the moment breathe. "The one I believe was forged. A quiet gasp rippled through the gallery. This was no longer just about missing paperwork. Jared was about to introduce someone who could unravel the entire case. Sterling shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. This witness was not disclosed beforehand." Jared turned to him. His voice? Even, controlled. "That's because I only tracked her down yesterday." Beat, let the moment breathe. "And what she told me." Pause, tension building, changes everything. Judge Grayson studied him. A long moment. Then he turned to Sterling. "I'm allowing it." Sterling stiffened. He knew. This wasn't going his way anymore. And Jared's biggest move was still coming. Because this witness wasn't just any notary. She was the one person who could blow this case wide open. The door at the back of the courtroom creaked open. A woman stepped inside. Linda Myers, a notary public. She looked tense as she made her way to the stand, adjusting her glasses, fingers gripping the railing, like she was steadying herself. Judge Grayson gave her a nod. "State your full name and occupation for the record." She cleared her throat. "Linda Myers, I'm a licensed notary public." Jared stood, his voice calm but firm. "Miss Myers, do you recall notarizing the second mortgage modification?" "For my grandmother, Alma Calloway." Linda hesitated. Her eyes flicked toward Sterling. I do." Jared nodded. "And were you present when she signed the document?" Another pause. A flicker of discomfort crossed her face. Sterling shifted in his seat. Jared waited, letting the silence work for him. Finally, Linda exhaled. "No, I wasn't." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Judge Grayson's gaze sharpened. Jared pressed forward. "Miss Myers, did you witness anyone else signing on her behalf?" Linda swallowed hard. Her voice, barely above a whisper. "No." Jared took a step closer. "Then how did the document get notarized?" Linda's hands trembled slightly, her voice shaky. "I was given the paperwork by a bank representative. I was told it had already been signed, and I just needed to stamp it." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. A notary public, admitting, under oath, that the signature had been notarized, without verification. Sterling shot up from his seat. "Objection. This is hearsay. Your Honor, she can't verify the legitimacy of—" Judge Grayson held up a hand, cutting him off. "Overruled." His tone? Different now. No patience, no amusement, just cold, sharp, focus. He turned to Linda. "Miss Myers, do you understand the legal implications of what you just said?" Linda nodded, her eyes glassy. "Yes, sir. I didn't know at the time, but I should have." Sterling sank back into his chair, a slow, heavy breath, hand running down his face. He knew. It was over. Jared turned back to the judge, his voice steady, unwavering. "Your Honor, given this testimony, the forged signature, and the missing mortgage transfer endorsements," Beat let it land, "I move to have this foreclosure nullified. My grandmother's home was taken through fraudulent means." Beat, final blow. "And now," he gestured toward the stand, "the evidence is right in front of you." Silence. Judge Grayson exhaled slowly, tapping his gavel on the bench. When he spoke, his voice firm, unwavering. "The court rules in favor of the defendant. The foreclosure is void. The property is to be returned immediately." Jared let out a breath, one he hadn't even realized he was holding. The weight, the fight, the endless months of research. It had all led to this moment. He turned, catching Sterling's hollow stare. The man who had dismissed him, who had smirked at the idea of facing him in court, had just been taken down in front of an entire courtroom. But Jared wasn't thinking about him anymore. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. His grandmother's home would not be stolen. Not today, not ever, but this case. It wasn't just about winning. It was about standing up, even when no one believes you can. Jared stepped outside the courthouse. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the steps. He paused, inhaled slowly. The air felt different. Not lighter, not freer, just real. The kind of real that settles in when a fight is finally over. His grandmother's home was safe, and that was all that mattered. A few people from the gallery trickled out behind him. Their voices hushed. Some whispered about the case, others about him. Snippets of words drifted through the air. Never saw it coming. That guy should be a lawyer. Jared didn't need validation. He never had. What he needed was justice. And today, he got it. A voice called out from behind him. Calloway. Jared turned. Judge Grayson, standing at the top of the courthouse steps, hands in his pockets. The arrogance from earlier, gone, replaced by something more measured. "You surprised me in there." His tone, not warm, but not cold either. Jared met his gaze. "You weren't the only one." A pause. Grayson studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Ever think about law school?" Jared let out a quiet chuckle. "Not really." For just a second, the judge smirked. "Might want to reconsider. You've got a talent for making people squirm." And with that, he turned and disappeared back into the courthouse. Jared exhaled, shaking his head. Law school? Maybe, maybe not. But one thing was certain. If anyone ever tried to take what was his again, they'd better be ready for a fight, because power doesn't just belong to those with money and titles. It belongs to those who refuse to back down. And if this case proved anything, it was this. The underestimated always have the most to prove, and when given the chance, they don't just win, they change everything.